On the night of October 8th, 1871, while the eyes of the nation turned toward the burning streets of Chicago, something far more devastating was happening hundreds of miles to the north, in a quiet logging town most Americans had never heard of, Peshtigo, a place surrounded by endless forests, miles of dry timber, and months of unbroken drought. A place where small brush fires had smoldered for weeks without causing alarm. A place where people went to bed believing they understood the risks of frontier life. But that night, a wind rose, sudden, violent, and unlike anything the region had ever felt. It carried sparks, then flames, then an entire wall of fire. What formed over Peshtigo was not an ordinary wildfire, but a firestorm, a massive swirling inferno so intense it created its own weather, its own wind, its own dark and consuming sky. Within minutes, homes disappeared, streets vanished, the town itself was erased. Nearly everything that could burn did, and everything that could flee ran. Some toward the river, some into the forests, some into the smoke. By morning, Peshtigo was gone, and thousands were dead. Yet the world barely noticed, because another fire in a much larger city stole the headlines. This is the story of America's deadliest wildfire, a tragedy overshadowed by history, forgotten by time, and retold now, slowly and quietly, as it deserves to be remembered. Before the fire, Peshtigo was the kind of place that rarely appeared on maps outside Wisconsin. A logging town built along a narrow bend in the Peshtigo River, surrounded by dense forests and miles of open wilderness. It was quiet, self-contained, and ordinary in the way many frontier communities were shaped, not by grand events, but by daily work, seasons, and routine. In 1871, the town was home to a few thousand people, most of them loggers, mill workers, shopkeepers, and their families. They lived in simple wooden houses built close together along dirt roads. The sound of saws and hammers was constant. The smell of cut pine lingered in the air. Logs floated down the river towards sawmills that stood like wooden cathedrals along the waterfront, tall and angular against the forest backdrop. Life in Peshtigo revolved around timber. The forest was both the source of income and the boundary of the world. Men worked long hours in the woods, felling trees, trimming branches, and hauling lumber to the mills. Women kept households running, tended gardens, and traded at small shops that sold basic goods: flour, nails, kerosene, cloth, and coffee. Children walked to a modest schoolhouse or played in open lots between the homes, chasing each other along paths marked by sawdust and pine needles. The town moved at a slower pace than the growing cities to the south. Days were quiet, evenings even quieter. Lanterns flickered in windows after sundown. People gathered at the local church on Sundays, and in the evenings shared news on porches or in the general store. Newspapers arrived occasionally, carried up from Green Bay, but national headlines felt far away. Peshtigo was a place defined not by the outside world, but by itself. Nothing in the town suggested that it sat in harm's way. Small fires were common in logging regions. Controlled burns, campfires, brush clearing, smoke drifting across the horizon didn't draw concern. People were used to living with fire in small forms. It was part of the work, part of the landscape, part of daily life. Yet the very thing that sustained the town, the timber, created conditions that few understood at the time. The forests around Peshtigo were dense, dry, and complicated. Logging left behind vast amounts of debris: bark, branches, stumps, and piles of discarded wood. This material accumulated everywhere, from forest floors to the edges of town roads. It was fuel waiting for a spark, though most residents thought of it as nothing more than the leftovers of work. In summer and early autumn, The region often experienced dry spells, but the drought of 1871 was different. Rain had not fallen in weeks, wells dipped lower, grass turned brittle, even the river dropped, exposing mud banks where children once played. People noticed the conditions, but frontier towns were accustomed to hardship. They adapted without complaint. What no one could see was how these circumstances, the drought, the heat, the debris, were slowly aligning with forces much larger than Peshtigo itself. A quiet town, surrounded by forests that had always seemed stable and predictable, was becoming vulnerable in ways its residents had never imagined. On the surface, life continued as it always had. Men cut lumber, women prepared meals, evenings passed in calm, with lanterns glowing softly in cabin windows along the river. There was no sense of danger, no warning that anything was amiss. Peshtigo was simply living through another season, and in the calm of that small frontier town, beneath the routine and the rhythm of everyday life, the stage for a far greater story was quietly being set. The year 1871 had begun like many others in the upper Midwest. Cold, long, and shaped by a slow retreat of winter's ice. But as spring turned into summer, people across Wisconsin, Michigan, and northern Illinois began noticing something unusual. Rainstorms became infrequent, rivers dropped lower than anyone could remember, and the heat settled in with a stillness that felt abnormal even for the region. By June, the ground was already dry. By July, small creeks had thinned into narrow threads of water, and by August, the earth itself had become brittle. Farmers watched their fields crack. Loggers found the forest floor coated with a layer of dust instead of moisture. Everything grass, shrubs, leaves, and fallen branches carried a hint of dryness that deepened with each passing week. In a frontier landscape where people were accustomed to weather extremes, the drought did not at first seem alarming. Residents accepted hardship as part of rural life. They patched wells, hauled water from the river, and kept working through the heat. But as the summer continued without relief, the dryness began to feel like something more than a simple lack of rain. It was persistent, total, unyielding. Throughout the region, small fires began appearing in the forests and along roadways. These were not unusual by themselves. Loggers often burned brush to clear land. Farmers burned fields after harvest, and sparks from locomotives frequently ignited patches of grass beside the railroads. Under normal conditions, these fires smoldered for a short while, burned out, and left behind only small scars on the landscape. But this year, nothing burned out. Fires lingered for days, sometimes weeks, hidden beneath layers of dry pine needles or buried inside piles of logging debris. Smoke settled low across forests and farmland. Residents grew used to seeing faint haze on the horizon each morning, a thin milky veil that drifted through the trees without attracting much concern. Even at night, a faint glow could sometimes be seen in distant woods, small fires burning slowly, too far away to threaten the town directly. People shrugged at the sight. Fires were part of life. They always had been. Yet something was different in 1871. The heat never let up, the rains never came, and the wind, when it did blow, carried with it the scent of dry earth and burnt wood. Some residents kept notes on the weather. Farmers recorded in journals how their crops wilted early. A mill worker later described the summer as a season where the land seemed to hold its breath. By September, wells in some parts of the region were nearly empty. Cattle wandered through dusty fields, searching for grass that had long since dried to straw. Across the forest surrounding Peshtigo, the drought created a landscape of fuel. Fallen branches, heaps of bark, leftover cuttings from logging crews. They were all baked dry under the sun. Piles of wood that would normally decompose slowly over months had turned into tinder. Even the soil itself, stripped of moisture contributed to the danger. Still, life continued. People hoped for rain, though none appeared. Newspapers reported on the heat, but offered no warnings. Most residents simply adapted, believing the weather would eventually break. As early autumn arrived, the days remained warm and the nights uncomfortably dry. The forest stood silent under the weight of months without relief. Leaves rustled with a brittleness that hinted at their fragility. Grass cracked underfoot. Streams lay still. In hindsight, it is easy to see the pattern forming. A town surrounded by millions of acres of dry forest, an entire region dotted with slow-burning fires, a summer without rain, and a vast supply of fuel created over years of logging work. But in 1871, the people of Peshtigo saw only a season of inconvenience, a long, parched stretch of weather that made work harder and water scarcer. What they did not yet realize was that the drought had prepared the land for an event far beyond anything in their experience. The dryness was not a simple hardship. It was the foundation of a disaster waiting for the smallest spark. By early autumn, the upper Midwest lived under a thin veil of smoke. It hung above forests, drifted over fields, and settled between the wooden buildings of small towns like a constant reminder of the long, dry summer. Most people no longer noticed it. Smoke had become so routine that residents treated it as part of the season, much like dust or falling leaves. Scattered fires burned almost everywhere. Some smoldered deep in the forest floor, hidden beneath layers of pine needles. Others crept slowly along ditches beside country roads. A few were set intentionally, burn piles left by loggers, brush burned off farmland, campfires tended by workers in the woods. They were small, and for the most part they seemed harmless. Frontier communities were accustomed to living with open flame. Wood stoves heated homes, mills burned scrap lumber to power equipment, and clearing land often required setting controlled fires. The line between safety and danger felt familiar, even manageable. People understood that fires were part of the environment, and in a landscape shaped by timber and tools, the presence of smoke rarely caused alarm. But in 1871, the circumstances were different. The drought had dried the forests to an extreme. The heat had hardened the earth, and all across the region, small fires burned with unusual persistence. Travelers often reported seeing thin columns of smoke rising from distant stands of trees. Hunters and loggers described glowing embers beneath the forest floor that refused to die out. Farmers spoke of burning patches of grass that reignited unexpectedly days later. There was a sense that the land itself had become combustible, holding heat, holding flame, holding the memory of every spark it touched. The railroads added to the problem. Locomotives of the era were powered by wood and coal, and their smokestacks frequently threw off sparks that fell onto dry grass. Along the tracks leading north from Green Bay and west from Milwaukee, entire stretches of brush burned on and off for weeks. Crews tried to tamp down small fires with shovels or buckets, but most were left to smolder, assumed to be harmless. Logging operations, too, contributed in ways no one fully understood at the time. Waste from the mills, bark, sawdust, scraps piled up in enormous heaps. Cutover lands, abandoned after harvest, became labyrinths of dried branches and toppled trees. Everywhere the industry went, it left behind a landscape that could ignite with almost no effort. And it did. In the weeks leading up to October, smoke grew more noticeable. Residents commented on it in letters, diaries, and passing conversations. Some described headaches. Others noted the constant, irritating smell of burning wood. A few worried openly that the fires were spreading farther than usual, but most brushed off the concern. Wildfires had always been part of life in the region, especially in dry years. They were something to tolerate, not fear. Still, The signs accumulated. On certain mornings, the sun rose orange, its light filtered through a dense haze. From the highest points around Peshtigo, one could see thin ribbons of smoke drifting across vast distances. At night, faint glows marked places where fires crept silently through the underbrush. Horses grew uneasy on forest roads. Even the birds flew lower, as if searching for clearer air. Yet daily routines continued unchanged. Loggers went to work, farmers tended fields, children walked to school through the scent of wood smoke. People talked about the fires as they would about the weather, an inconvenience, nothing more. The scale of what was happening was simply too large to comprehend. Thousands of small fires, scattered across millions of acres, were gradually merging, not into one single blaze, but into a region-wide bed of heat and embers, a hidden foundation of flame waiting for something, anything, to stir it into motion. No one could see the full picture. No one could imagine the possibility that the small, smoldering fires around them were not isolated events, but interconnected pieces of a landscape primed for disaster. In the softness of early October, with the forests quiet and the smoke drifting lazily through the air, the region felt suspended in an uneasy calm. The stage was set, the fuel was everywhere. All that remained was the spark and the wind that would carry it. Long before the firestorm of 1871, the forests around Peshtigo had already been transformed by human hands. Logging was the backbone of the region's economy, an industry that shaped the town, provided work, and fueled the growing nation's appetite for lumber. But the same industry also changed the landscape in ways that few residents fully understood. Over time, the very practices that sustained Peshtigo laid the groundwork for a disaster no one expected. By the mid-19th century, logging in northern Wisconsin operated on a massive scale. Crews cut vast swaths of pine and hardwood, leaving behind enormous quantities of debris, chips, bark, broken limbs, and the tops of trees too small or crooked to mill. These remnants were rarely cleared. Instead, they accumulated season after season, forming thick layers of dry material across the forest floor. Loggers called this debris slash. Most treated it as an unavoidable byproduct of the trade. It filled the gaps between stumps, collected in ravines, and piled high along skid roads where oxen had once dragged cut logs toward the river. In wet years, the slash posed little threat. It decayed slowly, returning to the soil. But in a year marked by heat and drought like 1871, it became a vast supply of tinder. Around Peshtigo, the evidence of the industry was everywhere. Tree stumps dotted the landscape in orderly rows. Patches of forest stood beside areas completely cleared of trees. The river, once narrow and quiet, had become a busy highway for floating logs downstream. Sawmills processed lumber at all hours, their tall smokestacks a familiar part of the skyline. Workers lived in temporary camps scattered throughout the woods, leaving behind fire pits, refuse, and occasional small burn piles. These practices were not unusual for the era. They were simply the way the industry worked. Efficiency mattered more than environmental management, and the science of fire behavior was still barely understood. People saw the forest as an endless resource, and clearing land seemed like a sign of progress rather than risk. In many parts of the Midwest, this approach created a new type of landscape, one that looked natural at a glance, yet was fundamentally altered. The mix of old stumps, fallen branches, bark strips, and piles of scrap wood formed a patchwork that could ignite easily. Winds could carry embers across long distances, jumping from one piece of debris to another. Small fires that might once have died out now found fuel everywhere they touched. In Peshtigo, this accumulation had been growing for years. Loggers worked quickly and efficiently, but cleanup was slow and often left unfinished. The industry's footprint extended far beyond the town itself. Dozens of smaller logging sites surrounded the main settlement, each contributing to the vast amount of debris drying under the unrelenting sun. Residents rarely thought about the danger. Many saw the leftover wood as a simple part of life in a timber town. Some used it for fuel. Others walked past the piles without giving them a second. Even when small brush fires crept through these cluttered areas, they were treated as normal occurrences. Something to watch, perhaps, but not something to fear. What no one realized was how profoundly the industry had altered the balance between land and fire. The forest was no longer a natural system capable of regulating small burns. It had become a patchwork of flammable material, arranged in a way that made the region exceptionally vulnerable to heat, sparks, and wind. By early October, the dryness had reached an extreme. The slash piles were crisp and brittle. Fallen branches snapped underfoot. Sawdust from the mills blew across the ground like fine powder. Even the smallest flame could find new fuel within seconds. Loggers continued their work, unaware that the conditions around them were approaching a tipping point. In hindsight, the danger seems obvious. Millions of acres of dry forest, years of accumulated debris, dozens of smoldering fires already burning, and a town built almost entirely out of wood. But in 1871, people saw what they had always seen: a productive industry, a thriving community, and a familiar rhythm to daily life. No one imagined that the forests they depended on had been quietly transformed into a vast, interconnected field of fuel, waiting for the right moment and the right wind to ignite on a scale beyond anything they had ever known. In the days leading up to October 8th, life in Peshtigo followed its familiar rhythms. Workers filed into the mills each morning. Farmers tended to what crops they still hoped to salvage. Shopkeepers opened their doors, swept their porches, and exchanged small talk with neighbors. Yet beneath the ordinary bustle, there were subtle changes, quiet details that suggested the land was shifting in ways few recognized. One of the earliest signs was the sky, not the sharp blue typical of early autumn, but a pale, washed-out color that seemed filtered through a faint film of smoke. Sunlight dimmed slightly, especially in the late afternoon, casting long shadows that appeared softer around the edges. Residents noted that the air felt heavier, drier, and somehow different, though they struggled to put the sensation into words. On many mornings, a thin haze hovered low among the trees. This was not unusual for the season, but it lingered longer than normal. It pooled in hollows and clung to the ground even after the sun climbed higher. People commented on it casually, must be more fires burning somewhere, and then returned to their tasks. At night, distant glows dotted the horizon. These glimmers marked small fires burning in the cutover lands, sometimes close enough that residents could smell charred wood when the breeze shifted. The faint orange light was visible from porches and windows, a reminder that the forest was restless. But no one saw reason to panic. Fires had flickered in those same distant areas many times before. What stood out more than the fires themselves was the wind, or rather the absence of it. For days the air had remained remarkably still. Leaves barely moved. Smoke from chimneys rose straight upward before spreading in thin layers across the sky. Even the river lay unnaturally smooth, its surface breaking only when a fish jumped or a log bumped against the pilings near the mill. Some residents felt uneasy about the silence in the air. Farmers who had worked the land for decades sensed that the stillness meant something unusual. But without warnings or scientific explanations, their observations remained private thoughts rather than shared concerns. Animals, too, began behaving differently. Horses seemed skittish on the logging roads. Cows wandered restlessly in their pastures. Birds flew lower and more cautiously, as if disoriented by the haze. These changes were subtle, moments noticed only briefly, often dismissed within seconds. The dryness continued to worsen. Wooden fences felt brittle to the touch, grass snapped beneath boots, barrels that once held water now needed frequent refilling as moisture evaporated faster than usual. Wells sank a little deeper each day. Some households kept buckets of water near their doors, a habit formed during earlier dry years. Others swept leaves and debris away from their homes as a precaution against stray sparks. These gestures showed a quiet acknowledgement of the fire season, but not a belief that anything extraordinary was coming. There were, however, a few moments that stood out, instances remembered by survivors long after the fire. A logger recalled a sudden gust of warm air that blew through the forest one afternoon, stirring up dust and carrying the smell of burning wood across miles. A woman living near the river mentioned how the sky turned an odd yellowish tint one evening, a color she described as sickly. A mill worker spoke of smoke drifting through the yard in slow, heavy waves, unlike the thin wisps seen earlier in the summer. Even with these signs, people went about their routines. There was work to finish, chores to complete, and preparations to make for the coming winter. No one had the luxury to dwell on vague feelings or atmospheric oddities. Life in frontier towns required practicality, and unless danger was obvious and immediate, there was little to do but carry on. What the residents of Peshtigo could not know was that the conditions around them were converging. Weeks of dryness, hundreds of small fires, tons of logging debris, and an atmosphere poised for sudden change. The land was ready. The sky was ready. The smallest shift in the weather could ignite everything. Signs of the coming storm were everywhere, quiet, subtle, almost gentle, but in 1871, no system existed to recognize them. No warnings would be issued, and no one in Peshtigo understood that nature was preparing to break the stillness in a single decisive moment. The evening of October 8th, 1871, began quietly in Peshtigo. Families finished their suppers as dusk settled over the town. Lanterns glowed in windows. The river moved with its usual slow current, and although a faint haze lingered in the air, it felt no different from the smoky evenings the town had grown accustomed to throughout the long, dry summer. For most residents, it was an ordinary night. Men returned from the mills, brushing sawdust from their clothes. Women tidied kitchens and prepared for the week ahead. A few late workers walked home along familiar dirt roads, following well-worn paths that disappeared into the half-light. Even as small fires glimmered faintly on the horizon, the town seemed calm, wrapped in the stillness that had defined so much of the season. But sometime after nightfall, the air began to shift. At first, the change was subtle. A single gust of wind moved through the trees with an unexpected force, stirring leaves that had hardly rustled for days. A few people noticed it, pausing to look outside their windows or step momentarily onto their porches. Some described the wind later as strangely warm, as though it had blown in from a different season altogether. Then another gust came, and another. Within minutes, the quiet stillness of the evening gave way to a rising, rushing sound. Wind swept across fields, along roads, and through the narrow lanes of Peshtigo with a swiftness that caught residents off guard. The sudden movement of air after weeks of calm felt unnatural. It rattled shutters and sent dust swirling along the ground. Across the region, the dormant fires that had smoldered for weeks responded instantly. What had been small patches of flame hidden deep in the forest floor were fed by the sudden infusion of oxygen. Embers were lifted into the air, carried by the strengthening wind. Dry branches that had lain untouched for months flickered to life. The warm gusts fanned every spark they encountered. People stepped outside to investigate, lanterns held high, faces turned toward the treetops bending in the rising wind. The sky began to glow faintly in places, an orange shimmer behind the haze, far brighter than the small fires the town was used to seeing. The light pulsed and shifted as the wind spread it, but the source remained distant, still beyond the edge of immediate concern. Yet the wind did not stop. It grew louder, more insistent, moving with a purpose that seemed almost unnatural in its force. It roared down the open fields south of Peshtigo, gathered momentum along the cutover lands, and pushed northward with accelerating speed. In logging camps miles away, workers reported the same sensation: a sudden blast of heat, a rush of air strong enough to topple small branches, the eerie feeling that the atmosphere itself had snapped awake. For a brief moment, people believed the wind might bring relief, perhaps the long awaited weather change that could clear the smoke and bring cooler temperatures. But the air carried with it not the scent of rain or the freshness of an approaching storm, but the sharp, unmistakable smell of burning pine. The dryness of the summer had created a landscape ready to ignite. The fires scattered across the region had created the embers, and now the wind provided the final piece. Some residents noticed ash beginning to fall, tiny flakes drifting through the air, settling on windowsills and doorsteps. A few families gathered their children indoors, sensing something unusual. Others stood outside, watching the sky with growing unease, lantern flames flickering erratically in the strengthening gusts. Then, almost without warning, the wind intensified once more. It surged with a force far greater than before, a sustained rush of air that bent trees and shook the walls of houses. It had the sound of something approaching, something vast, restless, and moving quickly through the darkness. In diaries and interviews recorded many years later, survivors described this moment with quiet certainty. They felt that something was coming, not a simple forest fire, not a small threat on the edge of town, but something larger, a force carried on the wind, advancing through the night. The peaceful evening of Peshtigo was ending. The wind had changed, and with it the entire balance of the region shifted. What had been weeks of stillness became motion, what had been isolated fires became connected, and what had been harmless embers became the beginnings of a firestorm. As the wind swept across the region on the night of October 8th, the scattered fires that had smoldered for weeks began reacting with startling speed. What had once been small patches of flame, hidden among dry leaves and fallen branches, suddenly found new life in the gusts that surged through the forests and open fields. No single spark began what followed. It was the combined effect of countless embers, lifted, carried, and scattered by the rising wind, meeting a landscape prepared to burn. The dryness of the summer, the debris of the logging industry, and the widespread smoldering fires across the region all converged in a way no one living in Peshtigo had ever witnessed. To the south and west of the town, the wind fed the flames until they grew into large moving fronts, creeping through the underbrush and then surging upward into the treetops. Branches caught fire instantly, whole trees ignited in seconds. Patches of flame separated by miles only hours earlier began to merge, drawn together by the currents of air that raced across the land. Residents who stepped outside into the night saw the sky changing. What had been a faint orange glow on the horizon grew brighter. The colors deepened into shades of red and gold, and in certain areas, the entire skyline pulsed as rising flames illuminated the smoke drifting above the forest. The wind continued to strengthen. It blew with such force that embers traveled great distances, landing on rooftops, in fields, and along roadsides. Some survivors later described hearing a distant roar, not a single sound, but a combination of many, crackling branches, gusting wind, and the low continuous hum of thousands of small fires expanding at once. The noise was muffled, but unmistakable, a sign of something vast, moving through the darkness. What formed over the forest that night was not simply a wildfire, but a firestorm, a rare and immense phenomenon that occurs when heat from a massive blaze becomes powerful enough to generate its own wind. The rising columns of hot air drew in surrounding oxygen at high speed, creating a self-sustaining system that fed itself with every breath. In this process, flames no longer behaved as separate lines or patches. Instead, they moved together as a single force. Trees bent inward toward the heat. Dry brush vanished instantly. The fire began to create its own weather, pulling air upward, dragging surrounding flames forward, and intensifying with every moment. The first people to realize the scale of what was happening were those living outside the main town. Small settlements and logging camps noticed the change earliest. Workers reported seeing fire racing across the forest floor with unusual speed. Some attempted to beat back the flames with shovels or buckets, only to watch them leap forward faster than they could react. Others fled toward roads or rivers, carrying what little they could gather. In Peshtigo itself, the warning came more slowly. The night air grew warmer, then hotter. Ash began to fall like snow, drifting in thin layers across steps and rooftops. Horses became restless, stamping their hooves and pulling at their reins. A few families stepped outside, felt the rising heat on their faces, and sensed something moving even before they saw it. Some accounts describe the wind arriving with a sudden, forceful blast. Others recall a growing roar that built steadily in the distance, but all agree that the change was abrupt. One moment the town was dim and smoky, the next it was surrounded by an advancing wall of heat and light. The firestorm did not arrive as a line or a wave. It came as a front of swirling, rising, shifting flame, a mass of heat moving with speed and direction. The air itself seemed alive, pulled toward the center of the blaze with immense force. Flames twisted into spirals as the firestorm breathed inward, creating what survivors later described as a moving furnace. Some spoke of seeing fire rising into the sky in sheets. Others saw swirling shapes like columns or funnels of flame. None of them had ever seen such behavior before. The firestorm approached Peshtigo with a momentum that could not be slowed. It had been building for hours across the entire region, fed by dry land, fed by debris, fed by the wind that would not stop. And now it was moving toward the town with a speed that made escape difficult and decision-making urgent. In those final moments before the fire reached Peshtigo, there was a brief, uneasy stillness, a moment when the wind paused, a moment when the roar softened, a moment when people stood and looked toward the tree line, seeing only the glow of something too large to comprehend. Then the firestorm changed direction and began descending toward the town. When the firestorm finally reached the outskirts of Peshtigo, it moved with a speed and intensity that left almost no time for hesitation. Residents who had glanced toward the tree line moments earlier suddenly saw flames advancing in a way they had never imagined possible, rising high into the air, twisting in the wind, and closing the distance between forest and town in seconds rather than minutes. The first instinct for many was simple: to run. Some fled toward the river, believing that water offered the safest refuge. Others moved toward open fields or along roads that led away from the thickest smoke. A few tried to gather belongings, though the growing heat made even small tasks difficult. Most simply reacted, guided by instinct more than plan, following the direction of others, in the hope that safety lay somewhere ahead. Darkness made everything more difficult. The night was nearly pitch black, except for the flicker of flames behind them. Smoke drifted low over the ground, obscuring familiar landmarks and making it hard to judge distances. People stumbled over fences and uneven paths, calling out to neighbors who were only faintly visible in the shifting haze. The wind complicated every step. It blew hot air across their faces. It carried embers that stung when they landed on skin or clothing. It bent trees toward the ground, sending branches and debris skittering across the road. For many, movement became a slow, disorienting effort through a landscape that no longer resembled the quiet town they knew. Survivors later described the sounds of that night as a mixture of many things: the rushing wind, the crackle of fire, the distant collapse of structures, and the muffled footsteps of people moving as quickly as the darkness and terrain allowed. But what stood out most was the absence of clear direction. There were no town alarms, no coordinated escape routes, no warnings issued in time. People simply moved in whatever direction seemed safest at that moment, toward the river, toward the roads, or toward open spaces where the fire's reach might be limited. For those heading toward the Peshtigo River, the journey was uneven and often frantic. Narrow paths were crowded with neighbors who merged into one another in the dim light. Some carried lanterns that did little to illuminate the way. Others held blankets or clothing over their faces to filter out the smoke. Many could see only a few feet ahead, relying on voices in the darkness to guide them. The closer they came to the river, the hotter the air grew. Some felt the heat on their backs intensify as the firestorm pressed forward. Others noticed sparks landing around them in greater numbers, igniting patches of dry grass or wooden fences along the route. The river, once a quiet and familiar landmark, now represented the town's best hope. For people moving in other directions, the landscape proved equally challenging. Fields that had appeared open and safe minutes earlier were quickly overtaken by low flames sweeping across dry grass. Forest paths became choked with smoke, roads filled with fleeing residents, some on foot, some in wagons, all trying to navigate a darkness that grew thicker with every moment. The firestorm's movement was unpredictable. Shifts in the wind altered its direction suddenly. Flames advanced rapidly in some areas while slowing in others. There was little time to assess or reconsider. The goal for most was simply to keep moving, to stay ahead of the heat, the smoke, and the encroaching wall of fire. In the confusion, families became separated. Neighbors lost sight of one another. Some people stopped to help others who had fallen or become disoriented, while others moved forward without realizing those behind them had turned back or been forced onto different paths. The night became a maze of movement, each step shaped by instinct, chance, and fragments of visibility in the shifting light. Accounts collected decades later show a quiet, solemn understanding shared among survivors that the journey through the darkness was not a coordinated escape, but a moment when individuals did whatever they could with the time and vision they had. It was not a panicked rush, nor a frantic struggle. It was something more subdued, a steady, determined effort to reach safety in a world that had changed within minutes. As the firestorm continued its approach, the darkness around Peshtigo grew thicker and the heat more intense. For those who reached the river, refuge was close. For those still on the roads, the path ahead remained uncertain. The night had become a place of shifting shadows, hot wind, and quiet movement, a moment when survival depended on direction, timing, and the hope that safety lay somewhere beyond the smoke. For many residents of Peshtigo, the river became the final refuge. As flames descended toward the town and the air grew hotter with every passing moment, people pushed toward the water, guided by instinct, by neighbors, or simply by the understanding that anywhere else offered little chance of safety. The river represented something solid and familiar, a place that had shaped the town's daily life. In the face of a rising firestorm, it became the only barrier between life and the advancing heat. Approaching the river was its own challenge. The smoke along the banks was thick, drifting low across the water and obscuring the shoreline. Visibility was limited to a few feet. People found themselves navigating by feel, following the sound of flowing water, the coolness in the air, or the silhouettes of others already wading in. Many survivors later recalled the moment their feet touched the river as a strange combination of relief and uncertainty. The water was cold, far colder than the air above it, and stepping into it required resolve. Some waded in slowly, testing each step, while others moved more quickly, pushed by the rising heat behind them. Once immersed waist deep or chest deep, many clung to logs, debris, or even one another to stay steady against the current. The river did not offer comfort, it offered survival. The heat was intense even from within the water. The firestorm that moved over the land created a wave of hot air that swept across the river's surface. Some describe the sensation as standing near an open furnace, heat radiating outward in ways that felt unnatural. Steam rose where the flames reached the banks. The air shimmered in the glow of burning structures behind them. Yet the water provided what the land no longer could, a shield. It kept people from the dry, burning debris swept along by the wind. It offered a place where breathing, though difficult, remained possible. It allowed them to stay low, away from the hottest air above. Many survivors stayed in the river for hours. They shifted their positions as burning fragments occasionally fell onto the water. Some submerged themselves up to their necks, lifting their faces only long enough to breathe before dipping back down. Others held onto floating logs to stay anchored, letting the current support their weight while they tried to remain calm. Despite the chaos on the nearby shore, the river itself remained quiet in a strangely steady way. There were no waves or sudden surges, just the slow, continuous flow of water moving beneath the drifting smoke. This stillness allowed people to keep their footing or hold on to floating debris without being pulled away. It also gave the moment a surreal quality, the contrast between the calm of the river and the relentless heat pressing down from above. Some people spoke softly to one another in the darkness. Voices traveled only a short distance through the smoke, but they provided a sense of connection, a reminder that they were not alone. Others stayed silent, focusing on breathing steadily and keeping their heads close to the water for the coolest air. From the river, the town's destruction unfolded as shapes rather than details. Buildings vanished into the brightness of the flames. Falling timbers glowed briefly before disappearing. Embers drifted across the river in long arcs. Everything familiar was reduced to outlines and shadows, moving within a larger, shifting glow. For many, the hardest part of those hours was not the heat, but the waiting. The firestorm did not pass quickly. It moved with an intensity that made time feel suspended. People remained in the water long after the worst of the flames had swept overhead, unsure whether it was safe to move toward the shore or whether the fire would return with another shift in the wind. Only gradually did the heat begin to ease. The brightness behind the smoke softened. The wind, which had roared so violently, started to weaken. The air cooled just enough for people to lift their heads a little higher, to look toward the banks, and to see the faint outlines of land emerging through the haze. It was then, after what felt like an endless night, that survivors realized the landscape around them had changed entirely. Buildings were gone, trees along the banks were charred or completely burned away. The shoreline itself was altered, covered in ash and debris. And yet within the cold, slow-moving water of the Peshtigo River, hundreds had endured. The river had become a sanctuary, not because it offered comfort, but because it offered a boundary the fire could not cross. A place where people could wait, breathe, and listen to the echo of a world transforming in the darkness. When morning approached, the fire that had swept through Peshtigo left behind a landscape that bore almost no resemblance to the town that had existed the day before. What had been a community filled with wooden homes, shops, sawmills, barns, and quiet streets was reduced to an expanse of ash, charcoal, and twisted remnants. The transformation was complete, total, and almost silent in its aftermath. The firestorm moved through Peshtigo, with unusual force. Survivors who watched from the river later described how entire clusters of buildings ignited within seconds. The intense heat dried wood instantly, causing structures to catch fire, not merely through contact with flames, but through radiant heat alone. Roofs curled and collapsed inward, walls folded, windows shattered from the pressure of rising temperatures. Much of the town disappeared in minutes. The speed of the destruction was a result of the unique conditions around Peshtigo. The logging debris that had accumulated for years acted as fuel. The prolonged drought ensured that even thick timber was bone dry, and the firestorm's internal winds pulled flames upward and outward with tremendous strength. Nothing built of wood, and nearly everything in Peshtigo was stood a chance against such a combination. By the time the fire reached the heart of the town, its behavior had shifted beyond what residents recognized as a normal blaze. Eyewitness accounts describe intense heat that seemed to move ahead of the flames themselves. People standing dozens of yards from burning structures felt the air become almost too hot to breathe. Fabric smoldered, hair singed. Some survivors spoke of feeling as if the fire arrived before it was visible. The sawmills, which had once been the center of Peshtigo's economy, burned with particular intensity. Stacks of lumber ignited like kindling. Buildings filled with sawdust and wood shavings produced thick columns of smoke. The machinery inside warped in the heat, leaving behind twisted metal shapes half buried in ash. Homes fared no better. Smaller houses along the outskirts burned quickly, with only chimneys remaining in many cases. Larger structures, including boarding houses and shops, collapsed under their own weight once the flames reached their internal beams. The fire consumed everything with the same speed and determination. The town's infrastructure was no match for the conditions. Rain barrels evaporated long before they could be used. Wells offered little help. Buckets of water carried by residents simply boiled or evaporated in the heat before reaching the flames. There was no fire brigade capable of resisting what the region faced. For those who remained in the river, the destruction of Peshtigo unfolded as a series of muffled sounds, a deep rumble as buildings collapsed, the crack of timbers snapping, the occasional roar as the firestorm surged through another block of homes. Through the dense smoke, shapes flickered briefly before disappearing, replaced by an orange haze that made both distance and detail impossible to judge. When the fire finally began to weaken, it did so gradually. The wind slowed, the flames lost some of their momentum, and the firestorm that had formed over hours dispersed into smaller, irregular patches of burning debris. Only then, in the early hours before dawn, did the glow around the town start to fade. As the riverbank cooled enough for survivors to climb out, they stepped into a world that no longer resembled their own. The quiet streets they had known were gone. Paths and landmarks had disappeared beneath layers of ash. The familiar scent of pine was replaced by the heavy odor of burnt wood and smoke. Even the air carried the stillness of a place that had been emptied of its structures, routines, and life. Chimneys stood where houses had once been. Iron stoves lay exposed, sitting alone in open spaces where kitchens once bustled. Tools, wagons, and personal belongings were scattered among the ruins, some recognizable, others warped or melted by the heat. The riverbanks, too, were littered with debris, broken boards, charred logs, and fragments of homes carried by the wind or washed ashore by the current. The completeness of the destruction was difficult to comprehend. Peshtigo had not simply been damaged, it had been erased. The firestorm had moved through the town with such intensity that little remained to hint at the life that had existed there only hours before. What once had been a community of thousands was now a quiet, flattened expanse, marked only by the shapes of foundations and the outlines of what had stood in their place. The sun rose slowly over the ruins, casting pale light across the ash-covered ground. And as daylight returned, the scale of the loss became clearer. not only in the physical destruction, but in the silence that settled over the town, a silence shaped not by the absence of sound, but by the absence of everything that had once defined Peshtigo. When dawn finally broke over Peshtigo on October 9th, the first light of morning revealed a landscape transformed beyond recognition. The smoke that had covered the region through the night began to lift in thin, uneven layers, exposing the outlines of the town that no longer existed. What remained was not a collection of buildings, streets, and homes, but an expanse of ash-colored ground marked by fragments of what had once been a community. Survivors stepping out of the river at daybreak found the world around them strangely quiet. The air, though still heavy with smoke, no longer carried the heat of the firestorm. The wind had slowed to a faint breeze, and the sky, pale and washed out by the haze, offered the first hint of daylight after a night spent in darkness and uncertainty. The river bank was covered in debris, broken boards, scorched timbers, and pieces of household belongings carried downstream or blown there by the wind. Clothing clung to tree branches. Metal tools lay half buried in mud. The shoreline had changed shape in places where the heat had been intense enough to crack the earth or cause trees to fall into the water. As survivors moved cautiously away from the river, their footsteps stirred small clouds of ash. The ground felt soft and uneven. In some places, embers still glowed faintly beneath the surface. The smell of smoke lingered everywhere, mingled with the scent of damp earth and the faint metallic smell left behind by burned structures. People walked slowly, many in silence, trying to understand what had happened. They looked for the landmarks that once guided them, the sawmill, the church steeple, the row of shops along the main street, but most had vanished entirely. Chimneys stood alone, marking the spots where homes once stood. Cast iron stoves, too heavy to burn, sat exposed in open space. Here and there, a metal hinge, a partially melted tool, or a piece of pottery provided the only clues to the houses that had been reduced to ash. The scale of the destruction became clearer with each step. Entire blocks were gone. Trees were stripped bare, their branches burned away. Wagons and fences were reduced to faint outlines on the ground. Even the roads were difficult to trace, hidden beneath layers of soot. Survivors moved through this quiet ruin with a careful attention, scanning for familiar shapes or signs of other people. Some called out softly, their voices traveling only a short distance through the lingering smoke. Others recognized neighbors by the outlines of clothing or by the sound of footsteps approaching through the haze. A few sat on the riverbank, overwhelmed by exhaustion after a night spent in cold water. They watched as the town slowly came into focus in the morning light, the full weight of the loss settling over them. Some tried to stand but found their legs unsteady. Others gently rested hands on shoulders, offering support without words. As the sun rose higher, the warmth of the day revealed more details. Brick structures that had survived the first minutes of the fire were blackened and cracked. Metal bridges were warped by heat. Tools left outside had fused with the ground. In some areas, the fire had burned hot enough to melt glass, leaving small pools of hardened shapes in the ash. Although the firestorm had moved quickly, its impact on the landscape was profound and far-reaching. Areas that had once been lush with vegetation were now open plains of charred earth. Forests had vanished, replaced by rows of scorched stumps, and in every direction the horizon was marked by a thin line of smoke rising from scattered, still-burning embers. As more survivors emerged from the river and surrounding forests, they gathered in small groups. Some spoke quietly about what they had experienced. Others searched for familiar faces, calling out names in the hope of hearing a reply. A few wandered the ruins in silence, taking in the enormity of what had happened with a kind of numb, unhurried disbelief. The morning after the firestorm was not marked by frantic movement or loud reactions. It was defined by stillness, by careful steps, by the slow, deliberate act of walking a landscape changed beyond recognition. And as the smoke thinned and the outlines of the ruined town became clearer, the survivors of Peshtigo began to understand the scale of the tragedy, not just in the destruction of buildings and land, but in the absence of the people who had not emerged from the darkness. The fire had passed, but the silence it left behind spoke with a weight all its own. In the days following the fire, as word slowly traveled across Wisconsin, news of the destruction in Peshtigo reached nearby towns and cities. Reports were inconsistent at first. Fragments of stories carried by travelers, letters and telegraph messages that described a fire of unusual scale, a town left in ashes, and a loss of life far greater than anyone had imagined. But outside the region, the reaction was muted. The nation's attention was focused elsewhere. On the same night that Peshtigo burned, the city of Chicago suffered its own devastating fire. The flames that swept through Chicago's streets that evening left a dramatic impression. A major American city engulfed in fire, its skyline illuminated in dramatic fashion, its destruction visible from miles away. The Chicago fire was easy for newspapers to describe, easy for artists to sketch, and easy for readers to imagine. It was a story that fit naturally into headlines. Peshtigo, by contrast, was a remote logging town with no telegraph office, no major infrastructure, and no early photographs to capture the scale of its devastation. Its destruction was total, but invisible from the centers of news and commerce. Communication was slow, roads were damaged, survivors were scattered. Even basic facts, the number of dead, the extent of the burned area, the scale of the firestorm, took days and sometimes weeks to become clear. As a result, newspapers across the country devoted far more coverage to Chicago. Illustrated weeklies published sketches of burning warehouses and collapsing bridges. Telegraph lines carried updates from urban reporters stationed close to the action. The Chicago fire became a national story almost overnight. Peshtigo, despite being far deadlier, did not. Early reports described the town with vague phrases: great loss of life, a terrible calamity, a town nearly destroyed. Few papers dedicated more than a short paragraph to the event. The remote location worked against it, as did the lack of surviving officials who could immediately provide organized information. Many local authorities had perished in the fire. The courthouse, town hall, and much of the written record had burned. In the following weeks, relief efforts did come. Supplies were shipped north from Green Bay and Milwaukee. Volunteers arrived to help bury the dead, care for the injured, and provide shelter. But outside Wisconsin, national attention remained fixed on Chicago's dramatic narrative of destruction and rebuilding. Over time, the imbalance in coverage shaped memory. The Chicago fire became a well-known event, taught in schools, referenced in books, and remembered in popular culture. Peshtigo, despite its far higher death toll and its unique firestorm conditions, faded quietly into the margins of American history. Its survivors rarely sought publicity. Many had lost family members and were more concerned with basic survival than with telling their stories to distant audiences. Early attempts to document the fire came mostly from local clergy, relief workers, and military officers, individuals who wrote with care, but whose accounts reached only limited readers. When the first comprehensive reports were eventually compiled, weeks had passed. By then, the national narrative was already firmly established. The great disaster of 1871 was the Chicago fire. Peshtigo had been overshadowed, not by its own shortcomings, but by geography, circumstance, and timing. The tragedy's scale was immense. Modern estimates suggest that more than 1,200 people died in and around Peshtigo, with some researchers believing the true number may be closer to 2,500. Entire communities vanished. Families were erased. The firestorm's power was unlike anything previously recorded in North America, and yet for decades the disaster received only modest attention. Part of this forgetting was practical. Peshtigo lacked the population, political influence, and economic infrastructure to drive public interest. Part was emotional. Residents did not wish to relive the night in detail, and part was simply the nature of the 19th century. Remote tragedies were often absorbed quietly into local memory rather than becoming national stories. But the effects of the fire extended far beyond the region. It revealed the dangers of unchecked logging practices. It showed the vulnerability of rural towns to drought and wind, and it demonstrated how easily a disaster of enormous scale could vanish from the national consciousness when overshadowed by events in a larger, more visible city. The Peshtigo fire became and remains one of America's most significant, yet least known tragedies, a disaster of immense force, whose memory faded not because it lacked importance, but because it lacked witnesses to carry the story outward. Its legacy would emerge slowly, shaped by survivors, historians, and the quiet persistence of those who refused to let the event disappear entirely. In the days and weeks after the firestorm, the full scale of the tragedy slowly came into focus. But understanding the true losses in and around Peshtigo proved far more complex than anyone initially realized. The destruction was so complete, the conditions so severe, and the records so limited that even basic details, such as the number of people who lived there, were difficult to confirm with certainty. Before the fire, Peshtigo and its surrounding settlements were home to a mix of permanent residents, seasonal workers, and transient laborers associated with the logging industry. Census records were incomplete, payroll lists had burned, company rosters were scattered or outdated. Many loggers lived in temporary camps rather than formal households, leaving little written trace of their presence. When the fire destroyed nearly all structures in town, it also destroyed the documents that could have offered clarity. Relief workers and government officials arriving after the disaster faced enormous challenges. The landscape was still hot in places, ash covered everything, roads were blocked, and survivors were dispersed across the region, some in nearby towns, some in the surrounding forests, and many still in shock. Even identifying bodies was often impossible due to the firestorm's intensity. Early estimates of the dead varied widely. Initial reports suggested hundreds. Later surveys raised the number into the thousands. As time passed and more information emerged, the estimated death toll grew more precise, though never exact. Most modern historians agree that at least 1,200 people died in the Peshtigo fire. Other estimates place the number closer to 2,000 or even 2,500 when accounting for outlying settlements, labor camps, and unrecorded individuals who lived or worked in the region at the time. Some entire households were lost without leaving a single survivor to report their existence. The fire also destroyed nearly every structure in Peshtigo. Homes, barns, mills, stores, and workshops vanished. Churches, schools, and community buildings collapsed into their own ashes. The destruction extended well beyond the town limits, sweeping through smaller communities like Uniontown, Sugarbush, and the settlements along the Peshtigo River. In some areas, there was no one left to describe what had been lost. Livestock perished in large numbers, fields burned, logging equipment was melted or warped beyond use. Sawmill machinery, normally built to withstand years of heavy work, was rendered unusable. For families whose livelihoods depended on these tools, the loss was more than physical. It represented the collapse of their ability to rebuild quickly. The human losses were equally profound. Entire families disappeared. Neighbors searched for familiar faces among the survivors, often finding none. Stories emerged of people who had gone missing, their fate known only by the patch of ground where their home once stood. Relief workers attempted to create lists of survivors and the deceased, but the records were inevitably incomplete. Burial efforts were difficult. The ground was hot and uneven. Simple wooden coffins were in short supply. Many victims were interred in mass graves, their names recorded only if someone could identify them. In some cases, memorials were created later, once families or communities had time to gather information and reflect on the scale of their loss. The emotional toll was equally significant. Survivors spoke of a sense of quiet disbelief that lingered long after the fire. Some felt guilt for having lived when others did not. Others struggled with the absence of everything familiar: homes, possessions, routines, and the people who had shaped their daily lives. The fire had not only destroyed property, it had fractured a community. Economically, the region faced enormous challenges. Businesses were gone, tools and equipment were lost. Supplies had to be shipped from distant towns. Rebuilding required far more resources than the surviving population could provide on its own. Relief efforts from Milwaukee, Green Bay, and other nearby cities offered significant help, but the scale of the destruction meant recovery would be slow. In the months that followed, newspapers occasionally revisited the tragedy, publishing lists of names, partial surveys, and reflections from relief workers. These reports attempted to convey the scale of the event, but many readers struggled to comprehend the quiet, rural nature of the disaster. Without dramatic illustrations or immediate telegraph reports, the Peshtigo fire lacked the visibility that similar events might have garnered. And yet, for those who lived through it, the numbers, however uncertain, carried a weight that went beyond statistics. They represented neighbors, friends, family members, and entire sections of the community that had vanished overnight. Each estimate, each list, each survey told part of a story that would never be fully complete. The exact totals may never be known, but the magnitude of the loss was unmistakable. In a matter of hours, the firestorm transformed a thriving region into one of the deadliest disaster sites in American history. What remained was a community marked by absence and the quiet work of those who stayed, trying to understand not only how the fire had happened, but what had been lost in its wake. In the weeks following the firestorm, the people who survived faced a landscape that seemed impossible to restore. The ground was blackened, the forest was gone, the town's buildings had been reduced to simple outlines in the ash, and the routines of daily life had disappeared along with them. Yet, even in this transformed environment, the slow work of rebuilding began. It did not start with tools or lumber, but with small human gestures, comforting a neighbor, sharing food, helping someone stand after hours spent in cold river water. These simple acts formed the foundation for what would come next. Relief efforts arrived gradually. Ships from nearby ports brought clothing, blankets, and medical supplies. Wagons from Green Bay and Milwaukee carried food, tools, and lumber. Volunteers from surrounding towns traveled north to help with burial efforts, medical care, and the first attempts at organization. Some were clergy, offering comfort. Others were doctors, carpenters, and laborers, lending their skills to restore the community in whatever ways they could. For many survivors, the first priority was to account for family members and neighbors. Throughout October and November, people searched the ruins, marking locations where homes had once stood and looking for signs of the missing. The work was slow and somber. Some remains were discovered near the foundations of burned homes. Others were found in open fields or along forest paths. Many had no identifiable markers. Identification was often impossible, and yet families tried, relying on memory, objects, or fragments of clothing. Where names could be confirmed, simple markers were created. Where they could not, communal graves were filled with care and respect. Meanwhile, Temporary shelters began appearing along the river and in areas spared by the fire. Canvas tents, makeshift cabins, and borrowed structures served as homes through the early stages of recovery. These shelters were basic and crowded, but they provided refuge from the approaching winter. Relief workers distributed food and clothing, allowing the survivors to focus on staying warm, staying fed, and staying together. As winter approached, rebuilding took on a more practical tone. The first new buildings were not homes, but essential structures: a temporary church, a small supply depot, a schoolhouse built from salvaged boards. These buildings gave people a place to gather, to plan, and to imagine a way forward. With snow beginning to fall, the land that had burned so fiercely only weeks earlier was gradually covered in white. The blanket of winter softened the harsh outlines of the destroyed town, but it also made survival more difficult. Food stores were limited, firewood was scarce. Many depended entirely on outside assistance to make it through the season. By spring, a new determination took hold. The ground thawed, the smoke from the last smoldering embers faded, and the people of Peshtigo began planning a more permanent rebuilding of their community. Sawmills were among the first industries to return. Rebuilding the mills was essential, not only for economic recovery, but for supplying the lumber needed to reconstruct homes and businesses. Workers cleared debris, salvaged what machinery they could, and erected new structures on the old foundations. Within months, saws were running again, the steady rhythm of labor returning to a place that had once been defined by it. Families rebuilt homes one structure at a time. Some chose to relocate slightly, settling on higher ground or areas less affected by the fire. Others reconstructed their homes in the same spots, using leftover stonework or bricks that had survived the fire. The new houses were sturdier in some ways, built with the memory of vulnerability still fresh in mind. The town gradually regained a sense of identity. New roads were laid out, shops reopened, children returned to school, church congregations gathered again, sometimes in buildings still under construction. Life did not return to what it had been before. It moved forward as something shaped by resilience and loss, by the shared experience of a night that had changed the course of the community. Over time, memorials were built to honor those who had died. The most notable was the Peshtigo Fire Cemetery, where the unidentified victims were buried in a mass grave, marked with a simple monument. The cemetery became a place of quiet reflection, a reminder not only of the tragedy, but of the persistence of the survivors who rebuilt their lives in its aftermath. By the late 19th century, Peshtigo had been largely reconstructed. New families arrived, businesses prospered again, the region regained its role in the timber industry. But despite the outward appearance of recovery, the memory of the fire remained woven into the identity of the town. Many who lived through it carried the experience for the rest of their lives, sharing stories with caution, gratitude, and a sense of reverence. Rebuilding from ashes was not a single act. It was a process, slow, deliberate, and shaped by both necessity and hope, and through it, Peshtigo transformed from a place devastated by fire into one defined by endurance. In the years that followed the Peshtigo fire, the disaster gradually shifted from an immediate memory to a subject of reflection. As survivors rebuilt their homes, and as new generations grew up in towns shaped by the event, people began to look back on the fire not only as a moment of destruction, but as a source of understanding, a quiet reminder of how easily human assumptions about safety and stability can be overturned. One of the clearest lessons came from the relationship between the land and the industries that shaped it. The logging practices of the 19th century, while vital to economic growth, left behind a landscape heavily burdened with dry, combustible debris. This slash, scattered across millions of acres, created a fuel source that magnified the impact of drought and transformed a region already vulnerable into one that was extraordinarily flammable. The disaster demonstrated how environmental factors can build gradually, almost invisibly. The drought of 1871 did not arrive suddenly. It developed over months. Small fires were visible everywhere, but normality dulled their significance. Everyday routines continued unchanged, even as conditions aligned toward catastrophe. The firestorm showed that the most dangerous situations often emerge not from a single mistake, but from many small, overlooked choices accumulating over time. Communication challenges also played a role. In 1871, rural communities had limited means to issue warnings or share urgent information. The firestorm moved faster than word could travel. By the time anyone understood the scale of the danger, escape routes were already compromised. In the years that followed, the disaster prompted discussions about early warning systems, fire prevention practices, and the need for more coordinated emergency responses in remote regions. The event also underscored the unpredictability of natural forces. The wind that night shifted with unusual strength, turning small fires into a single, immense front that behaved unlike anything residents had seen before. Understanding of fire behavior was limited in the 19th century, and the notion of a firestorm, a blaze generating its own wind and atmospheric conditions, was scarcely recognized. The Peshtigo fire became one of the earliest documented examples of such a phenomenon in North America, prompting scientists and observers to rethink their understanding of extreme fire behavior. For the people of Peshtigo, though, the lessons were more personal. They learned the fragility of daily life, how quickly familiar places can disappear, how suddenly routines can be replaced by uncertainty. They learned the value of preparation, even for events that seem unlikely. They learned the importance of community, as rebuilding depended not on individuals alone, but on shared effort, cooperation, and collective endurance. Over time, the story of the Peshtigo fire also revealed something about memory. Despite being the deadliest wildfire in American history, the event faded from national awareness, overshadowed by the Chicago fire. This contrast illustrated how public attention often gravitates toward events with dramatic imagery or urban settings, leaving rural tragedies underrepresented. The quiet nature of Peshtigo's community, combined with limited media coverage, meant that the fire's scale was not widely understood for decades. Yet locally, the memory endured. Families passed down stories, monuments were maintained, anniversaries were observed in small ceremonies. And as interest in environmental history grew in the 20th and 21st centuries, the Peshtigo fire began to receive broader recognition, not through sensational accounts, but through measured reflection on its causes, its impacts, and its relevance to contemporary challenges. Modern fire management practices, from controlled burns to improved forest monitoring, carry echoes of the lessons learned from Peshtigo. Understanding how fuel accumulates, how drought intensifies risk, and how wind patterns drive fire behavior has become central to managing wildfire-prone regions. The disaster stands as an early, powerful example of what can happen when environmental conditions align beyond the reach of human control. In the end, the lessons from the Inferno are not about fear, but about awareness. The Peshta fire reminds us that nature operates on its own timescale, guided by forces that can build quietly and release suddenly. It shows how communities can endure unimaginable loss and still rebuild. And it underscores the importance of understanding the land, not just as a resource, but as a dynamic, interconnected system. As the years pass, the memory of the fire remains a reminder of a night when the natural world asserted itself with overwhelming force, and when ordinary people found strength in the face of extraordinary circumstances. The story of Peshtigo does not end with the fire. It continues in the resilience of those who rebuilt, in the knowledge gained, and in the quiet lessons carried forward by a community that refused to let its history fade completely into the shadows of time.